John Denver was one of the most recognizable names of the 1970s, a soft-spoken voice who carried his guitar into millions of homes and gave people songs that felt like comfort. His music spoke of love, of mountains, of quiet places where life felt simpler. Yet away from the stage, his world was filled with restlessness, broken relationships, and choices that would cast a long shadow. When he climbed into a small plane on October 12, 1997, he carried with him not only decades of fame, but also years of personal struggle and controversy. What happened next revealed truths that many fans never wanted to believe. A childhood that never felt settled. John Denver entered the world on December 31, 1943, as Henry John Deutschendorf, Jr., born in Roswell, New Mexico. His father was a decorated Air Force pilot, a man who set speed records and was honored in the Air Force Hall of Fame. That kind of legacy inspired pride, but it also created an unstable life. The family moved constantly, Arizona, Alabama, Texas, never staying in one place long enough for Denver to build lasting friendships. By the time he felt settled, it was already time to pack up and move again. This cycle left him with a quiet sense of loneliness that would follow him throughout his life, even after he became famous. At the age of 11, living in Tucson, his grandmother handed him a worn Gibson guitar that had been built in 1910. For a boy who never felt rooted, the instrument became a kind of anchor. He joined the Tucson, Arizona Boys Chorus, learning harmony and stage presence. By high school, he was performing folk songs at local events, realizing that music could be more than comfort, it could be purpose. Yet even as he found himself, the shadow of his father loomed large. Known as Dutch, Henry Sr. was strict, a man who pushed his son toward excellence in ways that often created conflict. They rarely found common ground, except in one pursuit: flying. When Denver learned to pilot planes, he and his father finally shared something that felt like connection. Ironically, that same passion would later play the most tragic role in his story: the rise to fame and the image of perfection. By the early 1960s, John Denver was a young man searching for direction. He had enrolled at Texas Tech University to study architecture, but the pull of music was stronger than any blueprint. He left school, moved to Los Angeles, and made a crucial decision. He would shed his difficult last name, Deutschendorf, in favor of something shorter, something people could remember. He chose Denver, after Colorado's capital, a place whose mountains and rivers inspired him. It was not just a name change, it was a statement of identity, a fresh start. Denver's break came when he was selected from hundreds of hopefuls to join the Chad Mitchell Trio in 1965. As their lead singer, he gained national exposure, recorded albums, and honed his stage presence. It was during this time that he wrote "Leaving on a Jet Plane," a song made famous when Peter, Paul, and Mary recorded it in 1969. The single hit #1 on the Billboard charts, proving that Denver's songwriting had the ability to reach the masses. Even before most listeners knew his name, his words were already shaping American folk music. The 1970s cemented his status. With his breakthrough album Poems, Prayers, and Promises in 1971, John Denver rose from folk singer to superstar. "Take Me Home, Country Roads" became an anthem, climbing to #2 on the Billboard Hot 100. By 1972, Rocky Mountain High carried his love of nature into the homes of millions, eventually being named one of Colorado's official state songs. In the span of just a few years, he went from being a promising young artist to one of the most beloved performers in the country. The mid-1970s were his golden years. In just 18 months, he had 4 #1 hits: "Sunshine on My Shoulders" in March 1974, "Annie's Song" in July, "Thank God I'm a Country Boy" in May 1975, and "I'm Sorry" later that September. He dominated the radio, appeared constantly on television, and sold millions of records. His greatest hits album in 1973 became RCA's best-selling record at the time, even surpassing Elvis Presley. By the end of the decade, John Denver was not just a musician, he was a cultural figure. Yet with that fame came expectations. To the world, he was the clean, wholesome face of America, the man whose soft voice sang of love and mountains. He was described as the Mickey Mouse of rock and the Ronald Reagan of pop, labels that frustrated him deeply. He wanted to be taken seriously as an artist, but the very image that made him famous also trapped him. Behind the smile, Denver began to feel the weight of being something more symbolic than human. And that pressure, over time, began to erode the carefully polished image his fans adored. Love, marriage, and the cracks behind closed doors. At the height of his career, John Denver appeared to live the dream. In 1967, he married Annie Martell, the woman who would become the muse for one of his most famous songs. Annie's song, written in just 10 minutes during a ski lift ride in Aspen, became a timeless ballad, often chosen for weddings and romantic milestones. Together they adopted 2 children and built a life in Colorado that looked picture-perfect from the outside. Fans adored them as the symbol of love, stability, and family values. But fame has a way of seeping into private life, and their marriage was no exception. Denver's constant touring, recording, and appearances kept him away from home. Annie often described feeling invisible, overwhelmed by the shadow of her husband's fame. The more successful he became, the more fractured their relationship grew. By the early 1980s, the cracks were impossible to ignore. When their marriage finally ended in divorce in 1982, the truth began to emerge. Court papers and witness accounts painted a very different picture of the man the public thought they knew. Friends recalled Denver as unpredictable in private, with a temper that could flare without warning. One infamous incident shocked even those closest to him. After Annie cut down some of his beloved oak trees on their property, Denver responded not with words, but with fury. He grabbed a chainsaw and cut their furniture to pieces, even sawing their bed in half. It was a violent symbol of a love that had collapsed. The divorce damaged his image in ways that were difficult to repair. Annie stayed mostly quiet, but those who knew the couple supported her side, hinting at years of difficulty behind closed doors. Denver himself admitted to infidelity and mistakes, confessions that shattered the wholesome image he had carefully cultivated. The man who once sang of gentle love and natural beauty was now exposed as someone capable of anger, betrayal, and destruction. For many fans, it was almost impossible to reconcile the two sides. Even as he tried to move on, the scars of that marriage stayed with him. Later, in the mid-1980s, he fell for Australian actress and singer Cassandra Delaney. They married in 1988 in what looked like another fresh start. But the problems followed him. Their relationship was plagued by jealousy, distance, and Denver's controlling behavior. They had a daughter, Jessie, in 1989, a child Denver considered a miracle after believing he could never father children. Yet even this joy couldn't save the marriage. By the early 1990s, Delaney had left him, later telling Australian magazines that Denver drank heavily, lashed out, and drove staff to tears. The bitter divorce that followed left him feeling hollow, a shadow of the man who once sang of endless love. The decline of a star and the dark revelations. By the mid-1980s, John Denver's career was no longer what it once had been. Musical tastes were shifting, and the rise of synthesizers, drum machines, and a new wave of pop and rock left his acoustic style struggling to find space on the charts. For RCA Records, the label that had benefited from his massive success, Denver suddenly felt less like a priority and more like an outdated act. In 1986, after nearly 2 decades and 25 albums with RCA, the company abruptly ended their relationship with him. Denver had just completed what he thought would be his next big release, One World, and believed renewal was guaranteed. Instead, he was cut loose. It was a devastating blow. For years, Denver had been one of the label's biggest earners. His greatest hits still stood as one of the best-selling albums in RCA's history. To be dropped without ceremony revealed a truth he had long feared. Even superstardom has an expiration date. From that moment, he was forced to self-release through his own label, Winstar, a far cry from the corporate support he had once enjoyed. As his musical influence waned, the darker parts of his personal life became harder to hide. In 1994, he published his autobiography, Take Me Home, a book that stripped away the last of the wholesome John Denver image. Inside, he admitted to using marijuana, LSD, and cocaine. He confessed to cheating on both of his wives, and he described the infamous chainsaw incident himself, acknowledging that his anger sometimes went too far. Fans who had grown up with his tender songs were stunned by the raw, troubling honesty. Adding to the damage were his run-ins with the law. In the early 1990s, Denver was arrested twice for driving under the influence. Each case added another black mark to his reputation, but they also carried severe consequences. For a man who had devoted thousands of hours to flying and earned licenses for single-engine planes, multi-engine planes, gliders, and even hot air balloons, the arrests jeopardized his greatest passion. The Federal Aviation Administration refused to renew his medical certificate, effectively grounding him. Without it, his pilot's license was meaningless, the fatal flight and the mystery of his final moments. On October 12, 1997, John Denver climbed into the cockpit of a newly purchased experimental aircraft, a Rutan Long EZ. He had only owned the plane for a single day and had logged barely half an hour of instruction in it before taking off alone. That morning, he planned a simple practice session near Monterey, California, with short takeoffs and landings. For a man who had logged more than 20,000 flight hours, it should have been routine, but this flight would be his last. Investigators later discovered that the Long EZ carried design flaws that made it difficult and unsafe to operate. The fuel selector valve, used to switch between tanks, had been relocated to an awkward spot behind the pilot's left shoulder. To reach it, Denver would have to twist in his seat, sometimes relying on pliers to force the valve to move. Even the fuel gauges were poorly placed, requiring a handheld mirror to read. On that fateful day, the left tank ran dry while Denver was still in the air. Witnesses heard the engine sputter, then go silent. Faced with a sudden loss of power, Denver tried to switch to the right tank. In the process, his body movement likely pressed the right rudder pedal, sending the plane into a sharp nosedive. Within seconds, the aircraft plunged into Monterey Bay, killing him instantly. He was 53 years old. The National Transportation Safety Board conducted a thorough investigation and concluded that the crash was avoidable. Denver had taken off with too little fuel, failed to refuel before the flight, and was unfamiliar with the quirks of the modified aircraft. The unsafe placement of controls played a critical role, but so did his own decisions. To make matters worse, Denver should not have been flying at all. His FAA medical certificate had been revoked months earlier after multiple DUI arrests. Every moment he spent in that cockpit was, by regulation, illegal. One of the most haunting details of the crash was the silence. No distress call was ever made. Standard aviation training instructs pilots to send an emergency signal at the first sign of danger, but none came from Denver. Investigators speculated that the emergency unfolded too quickly for him to respond, or that he was too focused on trying to correct the problem. Others wondered if the communication systems themselves had failed. Whatever the case, the absence of a call added another layer of mystery to his final moments. Final words to Annie and the aftermath. The world mourned on October 12, 1997, when news spread that John Denver had been killed in the crash. Vigils appeared across the country, and tributes poured in from fans and fellow musicians alike. Yet beneath the sorrow was a painful reality. His death was not the result of fate alone, but of a series of choices, some mechanical, some personal, that ended in tragedy. For the aviation world, his crash became a case study in the dangers of experimental aircraft and the consequences of ignoring regulations. For the music world, it was the silencing of a voice that had once defined an era. In the years that followed, posthumous releases kept his music alive. The Wildlife concert recorded during his final tour became a treasured album for fans, capturing not only his timeless songs, but also his deep passion for nature and environmental causes. Exhibits, tribute concerts, and even a bronze statue at Red Rocks Amphitheater in Colorado ensured that his name would not fade from memory. For many, his legacy remained tied to the beauty of his music, even as his flaws and mistakes were impossible to ignore. But the tragedy carried an even more personal weight for Annie Martell, the woman who had once been his great love. Though their marriage ended in heartbreak, their bond was never completely severed. Denver continued sending her flowers on her birthday and Mother's Day long after the divorce, gestures that revealed the lingering affection he carried. Days before his death, Annie had sent him flowers for his birthday. He called to thank her, and in that final conversation, just before hanging up, he paused and said softly, "Oh, but Annie, I love you." She replied in kind, not knowing these would be their last words. Hours later, the man who had once written her the most famous love song of the 1970s was gone. That final phone call revealed something deeper than scandal or mistakes. Despite all the broken pieces of his life, John Denver's heart still clung to love. It was a reminder that behind the fame, behind the reckless decisions and the anger, he was still human, vulnerable, searching, and flawed. His story was not just about success or tragedy, but about the contradictions that made him who he was. For fans who still sing "Take Me Home, Country Roads" or Annie's song, those contradictions remain part of the mystery, one that time has not fully erased. John Denver's life was filled with triumphs and shadows, with music that healed and choices that hurt. His death closed a chapter that left behind both beauty and questions. What do you think? Should John Denver be remembered more for his music or for the darker truths that emerged later in his life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more.